Today we're going to be talking about the wrist move, and it's a move that I'm seeing big mistakes being made all of the time with students online and also students that are coming through that door for face-to-face lessons. And this is exactly what this channel is all about. It's inspired by what I see, like I say, on a day-to-day basis, to make sure that you're not making the same sort of mistakes or making sure that you're developing your game in the right sort of direction. So we're going to talk about one of the common problems that I'm seeing and also how to fix it in today's video. First things first to understand is predominantly most of your power comes from your hands and arms, not the body. What golfers need to understand is that your body works separately from your hands and arms, and they don't necessarily directly influence each other. So you kind of need to know how to train your hands and arms, and then obviously how to match that up towards your body. Now, what happens with most golfers though is if you don't sequence your body correctly, it'll have an adverse effect on what your hands and arms are capable to do, and that's generally what I tend to see with most students. But power comes from width, and it comes from the hands and arms, and that's why if you sort of turn the club upside down and you do this, you can kind of generate that nice swooshing sound. Okay, this is predominantly a arm movement. Okay, now obviously, like we say, if you work your body with it, your body will help you direct that release or that movement in the direction where you want to go, but it will add an additional bit of force. But that's the important thing. So predominantly what's happening, if I sort of now do this exercise slightly differently, like so, what's happened here is I've taken away the wrist movement. So the one where we can barely hear that swooshing sound is where we strip away all of the wrist cocking motion, and we don't want to be doing that. And that's a problem that I'm tending to see again with a lot of amateur online students. So there's really two messages to this video. The first one, and this is a great little exercise here, utilizing some resistance tubing. Put this over your head like so and tuck your arms through. Tuck your arms through it. I think this is great to give you a bit of feedback for probably the most important part in the golf swing, which is width. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm just trying to get myself into a setup position where I'd hold the club like so, and as I swing back, I'm just trying to turn my body but keep my arm, shall we say, pretty straight, okay, to try and maximize the width in the backswing position. So that's a big part of it. What you don't want to be doing is bending your arms, okay, because what we know is that when you start to bend your arms in the golf swing excessively, particularly if you bend this arm excessively in the backswing, again, it starts to affect the wrist functionality. So with a lot of golfers, they start bending their arms, and therefore you can't produce any of this wrist cocking motion. So the first thing is to understand that you want to try and feel like you're trying to keep your arms as straight as you possibly can, applying in theory width. Now, what should we be doing? Reference this. Well, the first thing is that when we hold the golf club, you want to make sure that the shaft of the golf club is pointing pretty much through your belt line. It's kind of okay if you want to have the shaft more vertical, but it's not something I would suggest is necessary. So I'd probably advise most golfers there, and that creates a bit of an angulation between the shaft and the club to get started with. Now, as you sort of take that club back, you're not going to necessarily increase that range of motion early in the backswing. You're going to try and think about that width feeling. But as you get to the top of the backswing position, you do need to start making sure that you are producing a roughly sort of 90-degree angle in terms of this backswing position. Now, one of the things that gets kind of coined around with a lot of instruction, or some instruction, is when golfers say that you don't want to try and excessively cock your wrists. But what I tend to see is that with students is the ones that seem to have an excessive amount of wrist cock, okay, so like this, it's not because they have an excessive amount of what's known as radial deviation, which is this movement, it's because they bend their arms. So the reason why you end up looking this way is not because you need to work on flattening your wrist, it's more to do with the simple fact that you need to apply more width. And what you'll find then is that unless you've got an excessive amount of range of motion in that area, which is extremely unlikely, that you'll start to look like you have a wide swing again. And all I'm trying to say is that if you end up trying to do things like flatten the wrist, really, it massively plays havoc on the sequence of the golf swing. So you tend to see golfers that try and flatten the wrist, they tend to do it too early, get the club taken behind them. But also, as I demonstrated earlier, if you take away this and you produce too much of this, then you're going to reduce your club head speed. And let's be honest, for most amateur golfers, it's not something necessarily that you can potentially be looking to sort of sacrifice. So the way I would suggest it is, if you want to do a little bit of this type of motion, of course, there is going to be a small amount of flattening in the backswing. But what I'm trying to say is, don't tell yourself the wrong story. Your arms and the wrists, this sort of uncocking and cocking of the wrists, play a huge role in speed. And that's not something that I would suggest most amateur golfers want to sacrifice. Understand the importance of width. Most golfers are surprised how much of a sort of stretch that will generally feel like, especially if you're sort of quite comfy getting this way. And if you are a little too comfy this way, that's why obviously this area will obviously look too limp, but that's also why this wrist position would start to look too exaggerated. So work on the width, try and make sure you're working on that wrist cock, and just go back to that sort of old L to L drill. So I get set up, take it back to lead arm horizontal, create a nice L, swing it through, create a nice L, and just sort of work on that like so. And what you'll start to notice is actually, especially if you can get a nice contact like that one, you'll start to get some decent distance because you're wider in that swing as opposed to more like so. See you guys again really soon.